Ma'am, this is my house. I just bought it.
We reported a possible break-in here. Can you tell me what's going on?
Officer, I'm David Evans, the owner. I closed 3 days ago. I was outside working on my front door lock. This woman called 911 falsely. I have all documents on my phone, can show inside.
Do you have ID?
Yes, sir, in my back pocket. May I get it?
Go ahead slowly.
I just lived next door for 2 years.
Ashley Miller had lived in the peaceful suburban townhouse neighborhood for 2 years when she made a choice that would end with her eviction. She fancied herself the neighborhood watch. And when she spotted a young black man sitting on his front steps, she didn't see a neighbor. She saw a thief. One cloudy afternoon, she confronted him, warning, "I've already called 911. You don't belong here." The man was David Evans, a skilled graphic designer and the brand new owner of the house. Her decision to harass him on his own property, all caught on his doorbell camera, would cost Ashley her home and show that sometimes the simplest justice comes in the form of an eviction notice. David Evans never thought that the happiest moment of his life could turn so humiliating. At 28, he had finally made it. After 6 years of relentless work, growing his freelance design business from scratch, working 70-hour weeks, skipping vacations, and carefully saving, David had enough for a down payment on his first house. Not just any house, but a stunning modern townhouse in a neat community lined with trees, known for being safe and welcoming. The closing had been just 3 days ago, and he still couldn't quite grasp it. He'd wake up in his old apartment, remember he didn't live there anymore, and smile. The keys to his townhouse sat on his nightstand, and every morning he'd pick them up, feel their weight, and reflect on his journey. David's path hadn't been easy. He grew up in a working-class neighborhood where owning a home seemed like a far-off dream. His mother had rented their whole lives, moving from apartment to apartment depending on what they could afford. She worked 2 jobs to keep David and his sister fed, clothed, and in good schools. At 12, David asked her why they couldn't buy a house like his friends' families. She gave him a sad smile and said, "Sweetheart, that's not for people like us, but maybe it'll be for you someday." That conversation stuck. David became determined to create something permanent, something no landlord could take away. In high school, he learned graphic design through free software and YouTube tutorials. By college, he was doing small freelance jobs. By graduation, he had clients. By his mid-20s, he had turned his side hustle into a successful business. The townhouse was exactly what David had imagined. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, an open living area with vaulted ceilings, and a small backyard perfect for the garden he'd always dreamed of planting. It was part of a 40-unit community, all built in the last 10 years, all kept in excellent condition. The Homeowners Association was present but not intrusive, mainly focused on neat landscaping and organizing occasional events. David had toured the property 3 times before making an offer. He had walked the neighborhood at different times to feel the atmosphere, to make sure it felt right. Everyone he met was polite, if not overly friendly. He'd seen kids playing at the Central Park, couples walking dogs, retirees tending their gardens. It seemed ideal. Moving day had been hectic but thrilling. David hired a small team to move his furniture and boxes from his apartment across town. His best friend Marcus took the day off to help, and his sister Kesa drove 2 hours with her husband to pitch in. They spent the day carrying furniture, building his bed, hanging pictures, and debating where the couch should go. By evening, it started to feel like home. They ordered pizza, cracked open beers, and sat on the back patio watching the sunset. Marcus raised his bottle. "To David Evans, homeowner, your mama would be so proud, man." David's mother had passed 2 years earlier, just before he began seriously saving for a down payment. He liked to think she somehow knew, and could see what he had achieved. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of unpacking, organizing, and running to the hardware store for things he hadn't realized he needed. David still worked remotely, taking client calls from his new office in the smallest bedroom upstairs. He had set up dual monitors, his drawing tablet, ergonomic chair, and the vintage desk lamp he bought years ago at an estate sale. It was perfect. Between calls, he wandered through his home, still amazed it belonged to him. He ran his hand along the granite kitchen counters, stood in the master bedroom enjoying the natural light, and surveyed the backyard, mentally planning where the raised garden beds would go in spring. On the 3rd day, David decided to fix a minor annoyance since moving in. The front door lock was sticky. The key worked, but it required jiggling and the right pressure to turn the deadbolt. The realtor mentioned it at the final walkthrough, saying the previous owners had complained but never fixed it. David felt confident he could handle it. He made a mental note to buy graphite lubricant or replace the lock cylinder if needed. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, he stepped outside to examine the lock. It was an overcast autumn day, the sky gray with little sun. Cool, but not cold, he wore a gray hoodie over a t-shirt and jeans. One perk of freelancing, he could dress casually. He stepped onto the front stoop, a small concrete platform with 2 steps to the sidewalk, just big enough to stand while unlocking the door, maybe room for a couple of potted plants in summer. David pulled out his keys and started fiddling with the lock. He slid the key in, turned it slowly, and felt it resist. He pulled it out and checked the key, making sure it wasn't bent or worn. Trying again, he wiggled it while turning, and the deadbolt finally clicked, though with more effort than it should have taken. He made a mental note to replace it soon. As he stood there, testing the lock repeatedly, his doorbell camera silently recorded every move. David had installed it on his second day, a smart doorbell with a wide fisheye lens covering the stoop and part of the sidewalk. It gave him a sense of security, especially since he lived alone. Focused on the stubborn lock, he didn't notice a woman approaching from the neighboring townhouse until she was right in front of him. When he looked up, he saw a white woman in her early 30s, blonde hair in a ponytail, wearing yoga pants and a zip-up jacket. Her arms were crossed, her expression sharp and hostile. At first, he thought maybe she was a neighbor coming over to introduce herself, though in a strangely aggressive way. Then he realized from the intensity in her eyes that something was wrong. This was Ashley Miller, though David didn't know her name yet. She'd moved into the rental next door 2 years earlier and had quickly built a notorious reputation. Ashley considered herself the neighborhood's moral guardian. She complained to the HOA over lawns slightly too long, left passive-aggressive notes on legally parked cars, and once called the HOA president at 10 p.m. to report a family birthday party that was barely audible. Most neighbors avoided her. Some thought she was anxious or bored. Others saw a need to control, to feel important in a life that perhaps felt small. Ashley had noticed the new neighbor moving in a few days earlier, watching from her window as the young black man and his friends carried furniture inside. She felt a twinge of something she wouldn't have named as racism, but that's exactly what it was. The neighborhood had always been mostly white, and Ashley liked it that way, though she'd never say so out loud. She told herself it was about property values, safety, or keeping the community character intact, comfortable excuses to ignore her bias. Seeing David struggle with his door that afternoon, her mind didn't go to the obvious solution, a new homeowner dealing with a minor issue. She saw danger. She saw someone who didn't belong. She saw a burglar. Ashley stepped out and marched straight to David, asking no questions and giving no introduction. She didn't pause for a second to consider an innocent explanation. She had already made up her mind and called the police. "I've already called 911, Ashley said, her voice sharp and accusing. "You don't belong here. Stop trying to break into that house." David looked at her, confused for a moment before it hit him with sickening clarity. This woman thought he was breaking into his own home. She had called the police on him, on his property. Anger flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew how dangerous it could get if he raised his voice or made sudden movements, especially with the police on the way. "Ma'am," David said evenly, keeping his tone calm and non-threatening, "for the last time, this is my house. I just bought it. For the last time." The words suggested this wasn't the first time he had spoken to her, though Ashley wasn't listening. Her face was a mix of self-righteousness and fear she convinced herself was justified. "I've lived here 2 years," she said. "I know everyone, and I've never seen you. Step away from that door now." Slowly, David reached into his pocket, showing deliberate, non-threatening movements, and pulled out his phone. "I can show you my closing papers, my deed. This is my house. I closed 3 days ago." But Ashley's mind was made up. She pictured herself as the vigilant neighbor protecting the community, imagining the praise she'd get for stopping a crime. She stepped back, wary as if David might suddenly lunge, and said, "Stay where you are. The police are coming." Homeownership is part of the American dream, but prejudice can turn that dream into a nightmare. If you believe everyone has a right to feel safe at home, hit subscribe and help share stories like this. David felt a tight knot in his stomach. He knew how quickly situations like this could turn deadly. He knew the statistics. He knew black men had been shot in their own yards over mistaken assumptions. Even when legal, the presence of police could make seconds lethal. He had to stay calm, stay rational, and prove beyond doubt he belonged there. Unlocking his phone, he pulled up the congratulatory email from his realtor with PDFs of his closing documents and photos of his deed, ready to show. Within minutes, sirens sounded. 2 cruisers pulled up, lights flashing. 4 officers stepped out, hands on belts, faces serious. David's heart raced. He raised his hands slightly, making his stance clear, thankful the doorbell camera captured everything. Whatever happened next, there would be evidence. The officers approached carefully, trained to be cautious, but aware that many calls like this ended up being nothing. The oldest of the 4, a sergeant with streaks of gray in his hair, led the way. He looked at David on the stoop, then at Ashley standing with her arms crossed, then back at David. "We got a report of a possible break-in here," the sergeant said. "Can you tell me what's going on?" David kept his hands visible and spoke clearly. "Officer, I'm David Evans, the owner of this home. I closed 3 days ago. I was outside working on my front door lock when this woman came up and told me she'd called the police. I have all the documents on my phone, and I can show you physical copies inside if needed." The sergeant nodded, already sensing the truth. Years on the job had taught him to spot honesty, but rules were rules. "Do you have ID?" "Yes, sir, in my back pocket. May I get it?" "Go ahead slowly." David carefully handed over his driver's license. The sergeant noted that the address was different from the townhouse, which made sense for someone who just moved. "You mentioned documents of ownership?" "Yes, sir." David unlocked his phone again and handed it to the officer, showing emails from his realtor, closing documents, and the deed with his name clearly printed. The sergeant scrolled carefully, being thorough. Meanwhile, a younger officer approached Ashley. "Ma'am, did you make this call?" "Yes," she said, still confident but slightly wavering. "I've lived next door for 2 years, and I've never seen him. I saw him trying to break in and called the police." "Did you ask him what he was doing first?" Ashley hesitated. "I didn't need to, it was obvious." The sergeant returned David's phone and ran his license through the system. Everything checked out. He came back to David, apologetic. "Mr. Evans, sorry for the mix-up. Your documentation is correct. You clearly own this property. I apologize for the inconvenience." Relief washed over David, mixed with anger and fatigue. "I appreciate that, officer, but please understand what happened. I was on my own porch, working on my own door, and this woman assumed I was a criminal. She never asked, never introduced herself, just called 911. That's not acceptable." The sergeant nodded, clearly understanding. "You're right, and I'm sorry. Anything else you need?" David felt empowered now. "Yes, I want this on record, a report that this call was made, investigated, and found to be false. I suspect this won't be the last time something like this happens." "Understood. We'll file a full report. You can request a copy from the station." The sergeant then turned to Ashley, his tone shifting from neutral to firm. "Ma'am, I need to talk to you about filing false reports. Mr. Evans legally owns this property. He was on his own front stoop, working on his door. You called 911 to report a burglary that didn't exist. Do you understand how serious this is?" Ashley's confidence began to crumble. She had expected validation, to be seen as a hero for protecting the neighborhood. Instead, she was being reprimanded. "I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe," she mumbled. "How was I supposed to know?" "You could have asked him," the officer said. "Introduced yourself, offered help, given him the benefit of the doubt. Instead, you assumed, wasted police time, and filed a false report. I'm letting you off with a warning this time, but if it happens again, you could face charges." Ashley nodded, but her expression showed she didn't fully grasp her mistake. She saw herself as the victim now, unfairly criticized despite thinking she did the right thing, a classic inability to confront one's own bias. The police left, their cruisers rolling away, leaving the street quiet again. Ashley went back to her townhouse without another word, slamming her door behind her. David stayed on his stoop for a long moment, hands slightly trembling, adrenaline finally catching up. 3 days in his new home and already treated like a criminal. He went inside, locked the door, and went straight to his office. He opened his doorbell camera app, scrolled to the footage, and watched the incident twice. His anger rose with each viewing. Every detail was there, Ashley approaching, accusing him, his calm responses, the arrival of the police. The entire humiliating encounter recorded in high definition. David knew he had choices. He could ignore it, chalk it up to an overzealous neighbor, and hope it never happened again. But he couldn't let it go. He had sacrificed too much for this. This was his home, his achievement, his version of the American dream, and he wouldn't be made to feel like an intruder. He opened his laptop and logged into the HOA community portal, where residents could access documents, file complaints, and contact board members. David started researching. He looked up the property records for the townhouse next door where Ashley lived and quickly found his answer. Ashley Miller was a renter, not an owner. The property belonged to Robert Chen, whose contact info was listed in the HOA directory as required. David leaned back and thought. He found the rental listing from 2 years ago when Ashley first moved in, then located the property management company, its website, and their policies. The standard lease agreement included clauses on tenant behavior, harassment, disturbing the peace, and conduct that could bring liability to the property owner. For the next hour, David composed an email to Robert Chen. He introduced himself as the new neighbor, recounted the incident clearly and factually, attached the video footage, and included the police report number. He didn't threaten or demand anything. He just presented the facts. He expressed concern about living next to someone who had already shown hostility, made false accusations, and created a situation that could have turned dangerous if not for the professionalism of the officers. David read the email 3 times to ensure a calm, measured tone, then sent it. He sat by the window, staring at the gray afternoon, wondering what would happen next. 2 hours later, Robert Chen, a property investor who owned several rentals across the city, opened the email with mild curiosity. As he read the contents and watched the attached video, his curiosity turned to alarm, then anger. He had dealt with difficult tenants before, late payments, property damage, noisy parties, but never a renter who harassed a neighbor to the point of calling the police falsely. That situation was a potential liability disaster. If David Evans decided to take legal action, Robert could be dragged into a lawsuit as the property owner. Beyond that, this kind of tenant behavior could hurt his reputation in the neighborhood and make renting other properties more difficult. He pulled up Ashley Miller's lease and read it carefully. The lease was standard, covering rent, maintenance, and house rules, but it also had specific clauses about tenant behavior. There was a section on harassment, forbidding tenants from intimidating, discriminating against, or harassing neighbors. Another section addressed illegal activity, giving him the right to terminate the lease if the tenant engaged in criminal behavior, which filing a false police report could count as. A general clause allowed him to end the lease with 30 days' notice if the tenant violated any rules or brought disrepute to the property. Robert didn't make the decision lightly. He spent the evening thinking it through, weighing options, and calling a lawyer friend who specialized in real estate. The lawyer confirmed Robert had solid grounds to terminate the lease, especially given the documented incident and potential liability. The next morning, Robert drafted a formal lease termination notice, citing the anti-harassment clause, the police incident, and the liability risk. He gave Ashley 30 days to move out, sending it by certified mail and also emailing a copy to avoid any confusion. Then he replied to David, thanking him for bringing it to his attention, apologizing for his tenant's behavior, and letting him know steps had been taken to address it. David read the email twice while working on a client logo. He felt a mix of satisfaction, vindication, and something deeper. He hadn't wanted Ashley evicted. He just wanted accountability to make sure her actions had consequences, and that he wouldn't live next to someone who saw him as a threat because of his skin color. That her choices led to losing her home was entirely on her. This wasn't about lawsuits or public drama. It was quiet, everyday justice, a reminder that knowing the system can be a powerful tool. Over the following weeks, David watched events unfold. At first, Ashley kept to herself, likely processing the eviction notice and scrambling for a new place. He noticed small things. Trips out at odd hours, a moving truck showing up about 3 weeks later, boxes loaded, furniture carried away, the slow dismantling of her life next door. David thought he'd feel triumph watching it happen. He imagined a sense of victory, justice served, but the reality was more complicated. Relief came first. Not having to live next to Ashley, not worrying she might call the police again for mundane things, was an enormous weight lifted. But he also felt sadness, not for Ashley specifically, but for the situation itself. For the fact that in 2024, a black man could still be made to feel like a criminal in his own home. For the persistence of prejudice in people who can't even recognize it. On the day Ashley fully moved out, David was at his desk when he heard the moving truck pull away. He walked to the window and saw her standing by her car, taking one last look at the townhouse. Even from afar, her defeat was clear, the slump of her shoulders, the heaviness in her stance. For a brief moment, David wondered if she reflected on what she had done, on the assumptions she made, on the harm caused. He doubted it. People like Ashley rarely reach that kind of self-awareness, too invested in seeing themselves as heroes. She got in her car and drove away. David watched until she turned the corner, then returned to work, to his life. That evening he walked through his house, truly taking it in for the first time since the incident. The open living room with vaulted ceilings, the granite kitchen, the master suite, the small backyard ready for spring planting. This was his home, his achievement, the reward for years of hard work. Finally, he could enjoy it in peace. His thoughts during those weeks had been a mix of anger, sadness, determination, and hope. He reflected on his mother, who never owned a home, and imagined how proud she would have been. He thought of other black families denied homeownership through redlining, discrimination, and intimidation. Mostly, he thought about using the system not to punish Ashley, but to protect his right to live peacefully. That felt like true justice, measured, fair, and effective. A few weeks later, David decided it was time to meet his other neighbors. He had isolated himself after the Ashley incident, unsure how he would be received. But now he was done letting fear dictate his life. He planned a backyard barbecue on a crisp autumn Saturday, printing simple invitations and walking around the neighborhood to invite nearby families. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People were friendly, welcoming, apologetic for not reaching out sooner. Some had heard about Ashley through neighborhood gossip and assured David she didn't represent the community. The day of the barbecue was sunny, cool, and perfect. David set up his grill, chairs, tables, and snacks. His friend Marcus arrived early to help, along with his sister Kesa and her husband. As the afternoon went on, neighbors arrived, families, couples, retirees, bringing side dishes, desserts, wine, and beer. They introduced themselves, shared stories, offered recommendations, asked about David's work, admired his house, and welcomed him warmly. Standing at the grill, flipping burgers and hot dogs, hearing laughter and conversation fill his backyard, David felt a shift inside. The trauma of Ashley's confrontation and his doubts about buying the house faded. This was the community he had hoped for. These were the neighbors he wanted. This was the life he had worked for. Later, after the last guests left and cleanup was done, David stood alone in the backyard. The sky was a deep purple, and distant sounds of cars and wind filled the quiet night. He thought about everything. The excitement of closing, the humiliation with Ashley, dealing with police, holding her accountable, watching her leave, and now connecting with his real neighbors. He opened his doorbell app, watched the footage of Ashley confronting him once more, not as a fresh wound, but as proof of what he overcame. He set the video to save permanently, not to dwell, but as evidence that prejudice exists, and that it can be confronted through knowledge, not anger. He looked at his home, warm lights glowing, built through years of determination. Ashley had tried to make him feel unwelcome, but she failed. David Evans was home, secure, and finally at peace. The front door lock turned smoothly now, replaced by him with care, symbolic of barriers removed. Ashley's harassment had cost her her home and stability, but David's actions ensured his own safety and peace. Justice had been quiet, methodical, and effective. He hadn't sought revenge, just accountability. Finally, he could simply be home in the life he'd earned in the community he'd chosen without fear or prejudice. He had the American dream, defended, protected, and celebrated in the calm of his own backyard.